Welcome to the Science-Based Targets Initiative training for financial institutions. This is module number 5, Scope 3, Finance and Missions, an overview. In this module, we will be giving you an overview of how to set Scope 3 finance and mission targets. At this point, you should be familiar with what science-based targets are and how to set targets for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions. After completing this module, you will be able to name required coverage for financed emissions, select the appropriate method for calculating targets, and determine how to address fossil fuels and thermal coal within your target. As discussed in Module 3, emissions are classified into direct, Scope 1, and indirect emissions, Scope 2 and Scope 3. Scope 3 can be divided into those originating from the company's operations, or categories 1 through 14, and those originating from financed emissions, category 15. In modules 4 through 7, we will explore how to set targets for each of these categories of emissions. Because Scope 3 financed emissions are so much larger for financial institutions, we will spend more time on how to calculate Scope 3 financed emissions targets. This module will focus on an overview of Scope 3 financed emissions. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, also referred to as the GHGP, provides emissions accounting standards. Scope 3 emissions are comprised of 15 distinct categories. The large majority of emissions and focus for financial institutions continues to be on category 15, investments. The key challenge surrounding finance emissions is that financial institutions are reliant on other companies, their ambition, and their data. As a reminder, there are 3 steps for developing a target. And setting targets for Scope 3 financed emissions utilizes the same 3 steps as in Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions. And these are setting boundaries, calculating the baseline, and calculating the target. Setting the boundaries for Scope 3 financed emissions should mirror those used in Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 operational. However, for calculating the baseline and the target, these will vary based on the selected method for Scope 3 financed emissions. Financial institutions who have already submitted targets frequently cite that setting boundaries and calculating baselines are the most challenging and time-consuming portion of setting targets and submitting their science-based targets. Before we jump into the slide content, I want to orient you to the tickers that you see on the top left and top right of the slides. We include these on all slides throughout modules 4, 5, 6, and 7, so you know what stage of the process you're in on the left-hand side and what scope of emissions this refers to on the right-hand side. For Scope 3 financed emissions, financial institutions are required to use the same baseline and boundaries as their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions. Detail on how to select the base year, determine the organizational boundary, and determine the operational boundary are available in Module 4. The first step that a financial institution must take when setting science-based targets is to understand which asset classes are required, optional, and not required for inclusion by SBTI. SBTI's classification of asset classes mirrors a balance sheet, with several products underlying debt, including commercial loans, consumer loans, project finance, and bonds. It also considers all equity products, regardless of ownership, and separately considers advisory services, which includes brokerage and the trading of securities and commodities as well. A core principle of SBTI's guidance for financial institutions is the influence principle, where financial institutions can catalyze change through their unique relationship with the real economy. For this reason, SBTI chose to classify asset classes not by their ownership model, such as listed or private, but by the type of transaction or service that is provided by the financial institution. The February release of SBTI's guidance for financial institutions is the version 1.0 of the guidance. Currently, there are still some asset classes that are optional and others that are excluded. As more data becomes available and methods mature, SBTI may revise asset class guidance to best serve and support financial institutions in setting science-based targets. Next, we'll discuss the specific products and their coverage requirements. The table on this page shows the same asset classes that were shown on the previous slide. The next column shows specific financial products. Note that this table only shows products that are currently required or optional for financial institutions. Excluded products are not listed on this table, but are noted in the footnotes. The last column shows the coverage that is required by financial institutions. Coverage can be defined by financial institutions to be in monetary value, such as enterprise value including cash, or EVIC, as a percentage of emissions, or using an SDA metric, which is an industry-specific metric, such as meters squared for real estate. Now let's walk through this table in detail. Starting with corporate loans, for power generation, financial institutions are required to cover 100% of their portfolios. For real estate, the requirement is 67%. For fossil fuels, financial institutions must cover 95% of their commercial loans. While SBTI does not currently have the fossil fuel guidance published, it expects to publish this by the end of 2022. For all other sectors, financial institutions are expected to cover 2/3, or 67%, of their loans issued to listed companies. Currently, all other loan types, such as loans to private companies, short-term financing, and loans to small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, are optional. For consumer products, SBTI currently lists residential mortgages as optional. Moving on to item C, project finance. 100% of project finance must be covered for electricity generation, and 67% must be covered for commercial real estate projects. Moving on to bonds, 100% of bonds must be covered from listed companies. Lastly, for equity, listed equity such as common stock, preferred stock, and others are covered at 100%. Any private equity investments made by a non-private equity fund are currently optional. We'll note that private equity funds have a separate guidance that can be accessed on SBTI's website. SBTI has additional recommendations for how to calculate the baseline and targets for various products, which includes setting at least one target per asset class to promote transparency. Financial institutions must also include all required asset classes, even if the asset class only represents a small portion of emissions or investment. And lastly, financial institutions submit a headline target, which is covering what percent of their portfolio is covered by the target that they have set. As financial institutions consider the greenhouse gas emissions of their portfolios, it will be helpful to understand that SBTI's target setting is complementary to existing carbon accounting methodologies through PCAF. Additionally, both PCAF and SBTI add an additional level of required accounting from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's original standards on Scope 3 finance emissions, as they require financial institutions to account for greenhouse gas emissions even when there is not a known use of loan proceeds, and you'll see that in the second row. Again, that is because the influence principle and the role that financial institutions have relative to their customers and portfolio companies in the real economy. One key item to note is in the bottom 3 rows, and that is that SBTI has slightly different product level guidance than PCAF standards. While both require commercial real estate, mortgages are currently optional for SBTI, and SBTI does not currently require motor vehicle loans to be covered, nor does SBTI have sector guidance available at this time for motor vehicle loans. Now that we've discussed the required asset classes and products, we will highlight the available methods for calculating Scope 3 finance emissions baselines and targets. On this page, we have listed 6 available methods to calculate targets. The first 3, which are grayed out, are only allowable for financial institutions' Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3 operational targets. We'll focus on the 3 methods on the right-hand side, which are allowable for Scope 3 financed emissions. And they are the sectoral decarbonization approach in orange, the portfolio coverage approach in purple, and the temperature rating approach in blue. Additional detail on these will be shared in the next module. The sectoral decarbonization approach is a type of physical intensity method that is used in select high-emitting industries where an industry-wide unit has already been decided. One example would be the carbon dioxide equivalents per square meter in the real estate sector. This method is preferred in any industries where there are sectoral decarbonization approaches and is similar to absolute contraction, physical intensity, and economic intensity and that they are focused on reducing carbon output. On the other hand, the portfolio coverage approach and the temperature rating approach are more focused on growing engagement, leaning in on the influence principle of financial institutions. The portfolio coverage approach measures how extensively a financial institution has engaged with their portfolio, specifically measuring what % of their portfolio has set a science-based target themselves. The temperature rating approach similarly measures engagement, but through calculating a portfolio's ambition, which is translated into a temperature score. Companies with no stated ambition are assigned a default temperature rating of 3.2 degrees Celsius. Companies with stated ambitions are evaluated on those ambitions and assigned a temperature score. These are aggregated and weighted for a portfolio-wide score, and SBTI has provided an open source tool to help calculate portfolio companies or clients' ambitions into an aggregated temperature score for a financial institution. Now that we have a high-level understanding of the methods, we can discuss which asset classes and products require which methods. On this page, you'll see the same product table that we saw a few slides back. Then, on the right-hand side, there are check marks for the allowable methods by product. As a reminder, from left to right, we have the sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA, the portfolio coverage approach, or PCA, and the temperature rating approach, or TRA. For power generation, whether it be a commercial loan or project finance down in row C, a financial institution must use the sectoral decarbonization approach. For real estate, whether a commercial loan or project finance, a financial institution can use any of the three methods. As a reminder, SBTI is currently developing guidance for the fossil fuel sector. As a result, there's not currently sectoral specific guidance for fossil fuels. Loans issued to fossil fuel companies should be measured using the portfolio coverage approach or the temperature rating approach. This is also true for commercial loans made to all other sectors, regardless of ownership. Next, across both short-term financing and small and medium enterprise loans, financial institutions can use any of the three approaches. If financial institutions decide to set targets on these optional products, SBTI recommends using the SDA or sectoral decarbonization approach on any allowable sectors. For example, real estate loans that are made to a small or medium enterprise. Additionally, small and medium enterprise loans are currently optional given the challenge that many banks in particular face with the number of clients and the size of loans, causing a challenge to fully engage with customers. Moving on to the next row, for consumer loans, residential mortgages are currently optional. If financial institutions choose to set targets on mortgages, they must, however, use the real estate sectoral decarbonization approach. To repeat, the same is true for project financing, for electricity generation, and for commercial real estate projects. For the remaining asset classes of bonds and equities, all three approaches can be used given the mix of industries that financial institutions will have within these asset classes. As such, we wanted to provide preliminary guidance on how to strategically consider which approach to use when financial institutions have several options. On this page, we relisted the three available methods and outlined a few considerations. Let's start with the sectoral decarbonization approach. As a reminder, this approach's focus is on reducing carbon emissions. We would recommend that financial institutions use the sectoral decarbonization approach for all industries where specific pathways are available. For example, bonds issued to power generation companies should be covered using the SDA. SDAs do require at a minimum estimated emissions data. But because they are used across industries and are well publicized, they are fairly easy to communicate to the public. It also represents an approach that is focused on reducing emissions, as there are clear expectations for portfolio companies and clients to continue to decrease their physical intensity. Moving to the next column into the portfolio coverage approach, this is an approach that can be used by any financial institution, regardless of their current ability to access emissions data, as financial institutions can choose to track their portfolio coverage in monetary or an emissions term. For example, I've reached 50% of my loaned portfolio dollars or estimated emissions. One additional benefit is that the portfolio coverage approach is intuitive and easy to communicate, especially to the public, as it simplifies the more technical aspects of combating climate change. However, one limitation is that the portfolio coverage approach is that it tracks targets. It is possible that portfolio companies set targets, but still do not reduce emissions despite their ambition. Lastly, we believe that the temperature rating can be used for financial institutions who have more data maturity. The core data inputs for the temperature rating approach are the ambitions of the financial institution's portfolio, which would require more focus on climate change and likely greater data maturity. However, since there is the default temperature score of 3.2 degrees Celsius for companies who have no stated ambition, the process for estimating data is simpler than that of the sectoral decarbonization approach. One challenge is that while the simple aggregated temperature score is easy to understand, the complexity and the underlying methodology and aggregation can be challenging to communicate, especially to outside stakeholders from a public relations perspective. However, the temperature rating approach provides more ability to focus on emissions reduction than the portfolio coverage approach, as it tracks the overall portfolio temperature score over time, measuring that stated ambition. We hope that these recommendations can be considered by financial institutions as they set their own targets. More detail into how to calculate baselines and targets using these approaches is available in the next module, Module 6. Now that we've discussed asset classes, products, and the methodologies to calculating baselines and targets for Scope 3 financed emissions, we wanted to highlight a few concerns that financial institutions frequently name, and they are around coverage requirements, grouping asset classes, and total coverage calculation. On coverage requirements, it's worthwhile to repeat that all financial institutions must cover all mandatory products, regardless of size. For any instances where a product can fit into two categories, the stricter boundary should apply. For example, in the case of a short-term loan to a fossil fuel company, the stricter 95% coverage requirement for corporate loans for fossil fuels should apply, even though short-term loans are currently optional. Additionally, it's important to note that financial institutions are expected to use their influence to help catalyze change across the real economy. This influence, for example, extends to the decision that asset owners have in choosing an asset manager or their financial consultant. For this reason, all funds where financial institutions has influence over the strategy, decision-making, or choosing the decision makers are to be included in the financial institution's target. This includes what most financial institutions was defined as a passive investment, given that financial institutions will likely have influence or strategy over the underlying securities. For example, a fund of a fund. This extends to any funds where the financial institution has voting rights, or third-party funds that have specific mandates, strategies, and external funds as well. To further detail, an asset owner could allocate a portion of their funds to an asset manager who has set a science-based target themselves. If the asset owner chooses to utilize the portfolio coverage approach, they are still responsible for noting the specific holdings and their approved SBTs within those holdings, and cannot simply apply the asset manager's current portfolio coverage. Financial institutions, again, must assess coverage of their invested funds. SBTI does recognize that a small amount of funds exist where a financial institution will genuinely have no influence, such as advisory managed funds and custody accounts. Moving to the right side, with regards to grouping asset classes, SBTI allows for select asset classes to be grouped, as long as they are using the same method. Financial institutions can group public equity and public bonds, all debt products, and all sector-based targets, regardless of the financial product that is offered. Thirdly, as a reminder, financial institutions must disclose the total amount of their lending and investing that are covered by their current science-based targets. Again, financial institutions only have to incorporate the required products and not the optional or excluded products. It's also worth noting that many financial institutions with submitted targets are covering 10, 15, 20, 25% of their lending and equity portfolios with their current targets. As financial institutions calculate their targets, for each target, the financial institution should consider their target year. For the sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA, targets should cover a year within the next 5 to 15 years. For both the portfolio coverage and temperature rating approaches, This near-term target must be within 5 years, since it is important for companies to influence and engage their portfolios to catalyze change. As it was for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions, tracking progress is considered in a similar manner. Financial institutions cannot include prior year accomplishments within their targets. For companies' levels of ambitions, the majority of SDA scenarios use the IEA's well below 2 degrees scenario, with a select few having 1.5 degrees SBTI scenario available or required, such as in aviation. For the portfolio coverage approach, the level of ambition of all financial institutions is that 100% of their portfolio has an SBT by 2040. This allows them to create change in the real economy by 2050. For the temperature rating approach, a portfolio level temperature rating, and therefore target, is generated for both Scope 1 and 2, and Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The Scope 1 and 2 emission must target at least a well below 2 scenario, and the Scope 1, 2, and 3 scenario must target at least a 2 degree scenario. However, SBTI recommends and encourages financial institutions to set their ambition to be at a 1.5 degree scenario for both of these scopes. Lastly, on the measurement methods, sectoral decarbonization approaches are tracking the relative intensity and its alignment with the associated sectoral pathway. For the portfolio coverage approach, the measurement method is growing the percentage of portfolio clients that have SBTs. Lastly, for the temperature rating approach, the metric that is tracked is the aggregated portfolio temperature rating. Now that we've discussed the key components and considerations of Scope 3 finance emissions target, we can highlight some examples of already submitted and third-party validated targets. To synthesize the content from this module, we're highlighting 2 example targets submitted by JB Financial Group and eSun Financial Holding Company. JB Financial Group is a leading retail and finance asset manager in South Korea. They set 7 Scope 3 targets, and their current target covers 19% of total investment and lending portfolios. Within their 7 targets, they use multiple methods. Since the electricity generation projects must be tracked using the sectoral decarbonization approach, one of their targets aggregates their electricity generation project finance portfolio with an admirable target of 67% per kilowatt hour reduction by 2030 from their 2020 base year. For their corporate loans, they use the temperature rating score. It's worthwhile to note that they included their small and medium enterprise or SME loans, which are currently optional. As a reminder, companies without a publicly stated ambition receive a default score of 3.2 degrees in temperature rating methodology. Moving on to eSun Financial Holding Company. They are a leading commercial bank in Taiwan, with much of their business to SMEs as well. They chose to set 5 specific targets, several of which are using the PCA or portfolio coverage approach. Their current targets cover 11% of their investment and lending activities by monetary value. For their portfolio loans, they're covering 33% of their portfolio by loan value across several sectors. These sectors are not currently required to use the SDA, even though some, such as pulp and paper and cement, do have SDA pathways. For eSun's equity and bonds portfolio, which they decided to aggregate since they're using the same methodology, they also set a PCA target. We have 2 more slides left in this module, first covering thermal coals and fossil fuels, and last with the takeaways. SBTI currently recommends several actions regarding thermal coal and fossil fuel companies. To begin, SBTI defines any thermal coal company to be a company that has 5% or more of their revenue from coal activities. For fossil fuels, financial institutions can set their own baseline threshold. SBTI recommends a range of 5 to 30% revenue. For example, a financial institution could consider setting a 20% threshold of fossil fuel revenue. In this scenario, companies with less than 20% of their revenue from fossil fuels would not be considered a fossil fuel company. With regards to the approach that SBTI recommends, financial institutions should establish a phase-out policy for investments in thermal coal and cease all new investments. This phase-out should be completed by 2030. For fossil fuels, SBTI recommends that financial institutions disclose their current financing of fossil fuels and continue to engage and influence their transition. All fossil fuel investments must be covered by the targets within the previously discussed 95% coverage requirements. While there are not currently specific requirements on investment and phase-out policies, all fossil fuel lending must be put on a Paris-aligned pathway in order to get validated. SBTI is working on a more comprehensive fossil fuel policy, which will be implemented in the Net Zero Standard, which defines disclosure, transition, and phase-out requirements for all fossil fuel financing. To contextualize this, we've also included GFANZ's guidance on both thermal coal and fossil fuels. GFANZ also recommends phasing out thermal coal, but does not require a specific date like SBTI's recommendation. On fossil fuels, GFANZ notes that fossil fuel companies should align to 1.5-degree aligned pathways, but does not recommend a method or timeline to require fossil fuel companies to be on these pathways. It's helpful to note that on June 15, 2022, Race to Zero published an update to their criteria, which included halting investments in coal and fossil fuel. This means that participants would have to restrict the development, financing, and facilitation of new fossil fuel assets, including no new coal projects. After completing this module, we hope that participants are able to know what coverage requirements are for relevant products and seek out the SBTI guidance for more details. Apply the 3 methods for calculating Scope 3 financed emissions for their baselines and targets: the sectoral decarbonization approach, portfolio coverage approach, and temperature rating approach, and disclose thermal coal and fossil fuel activities per SBTI's recommendations. Thank you for listening.